European Theatre, Autumn 1943. American bomber crews are climbing into their B-17 flying fortresses, knowing the statistics. And the statistics are a death sentence written in contrails and burning aluminum. For every 25 missions flown over Germany, the odds of surviving are roughly 1 in 4. The numbers aren't improving, they're getting worse. The Boeing B-17 is supposed to be a fortress, hence the name. 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines producing 1,200 horsepower each. 13 50 caliber machine guns bristling from every angle. A service ceiling of 35,000 feet. On paper, it's an intimidating weapons platform. In practice, over the skies of Schweinfurt and Regensburg, it's a slow-moving target that Luftwaffe pilots are destroying with methodical efficiency. The problem isn't the aircraft's defensive armament. The problem isn't crew courage. American bomber crews have that in abundance. The problem is physics. Specifically, the physics of a 65,000-pound aircraft trying to maneuver against single-seat fighters that weigh 1/10 as much and carry twice the power-to-weight ratio. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When a Focke-Wulf FOVU 190 initiates an attack run, it's approaching at 400 miles per hour with 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. The closing speed is devastating. The B-17's top speed is 287 miles per hour, straight and level, and that's optimistic. In combat formation, maintaining position with other bombers, you're actually flying at 180 to 200 miles per hour to keep the formation tight. A fighter pilot sees a formation of B-17 seconds, picks his target, and positions himself for the attack. Head-on passes are preferred aim for the cockpit, where 2 bursts from 20mm cannons will kill the pilots and send 10 men to their deaths. Beam attacks work too, raking the fuselage from wingtip to tail. The B-17. Gunners are firing back. Absolutely. But hitting a fighter moving at 400 miles per hour with a manually aimed gun mount is like trying to shoot a bullet with another bullet. Lieutenant Colonel Curtis LeMay, commanding the 305th Bomb Group, watches his formations get shredded through October 1943 and starts asking questions that make his superiors uncomfortable. The standard evasive maneuver for bombers under fighter attack is a shallow diving turn, lose 500 feet, gain some airspeed, hope the fighters break off. It doesn't work. The fighters just follow you down, adjusting their deflection angles, continuing their attacks until either they're out of ammunition or you're going down in flames. Some pilots try violent evasive maneuvers, hard banks, steep dives, anything to throw off the fighter's aim. This works occasionally, but it also throws you out of formation. And a B-17 outside the formation is a dead B-17. The concentrated defensive fire of a tight formation is the only thing keeping the Luftwaffe from achieving 100% kill rates. Break formation to evade, and you're alone. Alone means you're facing multiple fighters without mutual support. Your life expectancy is measured in minutes. LeMay studies the after-action reports from every mission through late 1943. He's looking for patterns, for anything that worked, even once. Most reports describe the same nightmare fighters attacking from every angle, B-17 seconds absorbing punishment, some making it home with dead engines and wounded crew, some disappearing in fireballs at 25,000 feet. But there are outliers, rare incidents where bombers survive sustained attacks. LeMay finds one report from a pilot named Captain James Howard, 91st Bomb Group, dated October 14, 1943, the second Schweinfurt raid, the mission where the 8th Air Force loses 60 bombers in a single day. Howard's B-17 takes fire from at least 8 different FW 190 seconds during a 12-minute period. His aircraft suffers 30 separate hits. One engine is destroyed. The oxygen system in the waist section is compromised, and yet his aircraft makes it back to England. The other 3 bombers in his flight element don't survive. LeMay reads Howard's account 3 times, looking for the anomaly. Most of the report is standard fighter approaches, guns firing, hits sustained. Then there's a section that doesn't match the usual pattern. At 1,347 hours, 4 few, 190 seconds, positioned for a coordinated attack from our 3 o'clock level. Standard protocol would be to maintain level flight and rely on defensive fire. I observed their closure rate and calculated we had approximately 12 seconds before they achieved firing position. I pushed all 4 throttles to maximum and initiated a climbing turn of 15 degrees, increasing to 20 degrees. The fighters opened fire at 800 yards, but their deflection was wrong. Their rounds passed below our aircraft. They broke off and repositioned. We maintained climb through their second pass. Same result, they couldn't adjust their aim point quickly enough. LeMay brings this report to his operations officer. Has anyone else tried climbing into an attack? The operations officer looks confused. Sir, the B-17 climbs at maybe 900 feet per minute at combat weight. The fighters climb at 3,000 feet per minute. Climbing against a fighter attack is suicide. Then why did Howard survive when everyone else in his element died? Nobody has an answer for that. The B-17's climb rate is genuinely pathetic compared to fighters. At 65,000 pounds gross weight, which is typical for a combat mission over Germany, the aircraft manages approximately 900 feet per minute at sea level. At 25,000 feet, where most bomber operations occur, that rate drops to 300 to 400 feet per minute. An FW-190 at the same altitude climbs at 2,800 feet per minute. A Bf-109, Gustav manages 3,100 feet per minute. In a straight vertical race, there's no contest. The fighter will be 5,000 feet above you in less than 2 minutes. But Curtis LeMay understands something about fighter attacks that most people miss. The fighters aren't trying to climb with you. They're trying to shoot you. And shooting a climbing target is fundamentally different from shooting a level target. When a fighter pilot sets up an attack run against a level bomber, he's solving a relatively simple geometry problem. The target is moving at 180 miles per hour on a predictable horizontal path. You approach at 400 miles per hour, calculate the deflection angle based on closure rate and distance, and open fire when your gun sight reaches the proper lead angle. It's still difficult. You're doing calculus at 25,000 feet while dealing with hypoxia and adrenaline, but it's a solvable problem. Luftwaffe pilots practice this constantly. They're good at it. Now change one variable. The bomber starts climbing at 15 degrees. It's still only gaining 300 feet per minute, but that 15-degree angle changes everything about the deflection calculation. The target is now moving in 3 dimensions instead of 2. The fighter pilot has to adjust his aim point not just horizontally but vertically, and he has to do it while his own aircraft is also changing altitude and attitude. More critically, the fighter pilot's gun sight is calibrated for level attacks or diving attacks. The gyroscopic computing gun sight that Luftwaffe fighters use in 1943 is a remarkable piece of engineering. You put the pipper on the target, the sight calculates deflection, and you fire. But it calculates deflection based on the assumption that the target is maintaining level flight or a steady dive. Feed it a climbing target, and the calculations become increasingly inaccurate the steeper the climb. LeMay doesn't know the technical details of German gun sights, but he understands angles and timing. If a B-17 can climb at even 15 degrees for the 12 seconds, it takes a fighter to close from 1,000 yards to firing range. That bomber has changed altitude by approximately 200 feet. Not much, except the fighter's aim point was calculated for where the bomber would be if it maintained level flight. Those rounds go sailing underneath or behind the aircraft. The fighter pilot can adjust. He can recalculate and make a second pass. But that takes time, and in a combat box formation with 5 4B-17 seconds flying in tight defensive array, time means other bombers are now shooting at him. The longer he stays in the formation's envelope, the higher his risk of getting hit by defensive fire. LeMay starts running numbers in November 1943. The 305th Bomb Group's loss rate for missions over Germany is running at 7.8% per mission. At that rate, the entire group will be destroyed in statistically 13 missions. Fresh crews arriving from the States have a life expectancy of approximately 8 sorties before being killed, seriously wounded, or becoming prisoners of war. These numbers are unsustainable, and everyone knows it. The 8th Air Force is burning through crews faster than training commands can replace them. Something has to change, or the strategic bombing campaign will collapse under its own casualties. January 1944. Curtis LeMay, now commanding the 3rd Bomb Division, has authorization to experiment with tactics. Authorization came grudgingly from 8th Air Force headquarters after LeMay pointed out that losing bombers at the current rate wasn't a tactic, it was a slow-motion disaster. LeMay designs a training program that every pilot in the 3rd Division must complete before flying combat missions. The program focuses on one specific maneuver, the emergency climb. Not a gradual climb, not a gentle altitude change. An emergency climb executed at maximum throttle the instant a fighter commits to an attack run. The procedure is specific. The moment you identify a fighter positioning for attack, typically 1,000 to 1,200 yards out, the pilot pushes all 4 throttles to 100% power. Simultaneously, the pilot initiates a climb of 15 to 20 degrees. The co-pilot monitors engine, temperatures and watches for the flight leader's position. The entire maneuver lasts only 10 to 15 seconds, just long enough to disrupt the fighter's firing solution. As soon as the fighter breaks off or passes, you level out and return to formation altitude. The initial reaction from pilots is skeptical. One pilot in the 379th Bomb Group describes the briefing. "The colonel is telling us to climb toward fighters. With respect, sir, that's insane. We climb at 400 feet per minute. They climb at 3,000. We're giving them a better target." LeMay's response, recorded in the 379th Group's training notes. "You're not trying to outclimb them. You're trying to ruin their aim for 12 seconds. 12 seconds is the difference between them hitting your aircraft and their rounds going wild." Training flights begin over England. B-17 formations practice the maneuver repeatedly. Pilots discover immediately that executing a coordinated climb across an entire formation is harder than it sounds. The lead aircraft initiates the climb, but the aircraft on the wings have to match that climb while maintaining position. Too slow to react, and you fall out of formation. Too aggressive, and you climb into the aircraft above you. It takes 3 weeks of intensive practice before the maneuvers become smooth. 3 weeks where crews are training instead of flying combat missions, which means LeMay is taking heat from headquarters about reduced sortie rates. But LeMay refuses to rush the training. If this doesn't work, a lot of people are going to die. If it does work, and crews aren't properly trained, they'll die anyway. The first operational test happens on January 11th, 1944 during a mission to Oschersleben. The 3rd Bomb Division puts up 183 B-17 seconds targeting aircraft manufacturing facilities. Luftwaffe response is immediate, and heavy approximately 200 German fighters intercept the formation. The 379th Bomb Group, flying in the lead combat box, encounters fighters at 24,000 feet. Major Louis Lyle, leading the group, identifies 4 Fevu 190 seconds positioning for a head-on attack. Range approximately 1,100 yards and closing at combined speed of 580 miles per hour. Lyle's action report. Executed emergency climb per doctrine. All aircraft in formation responded. Climb angle 18 degrees, duration 11 seconds. Enemy fighters opened fire at approximately 700 yards. Observed tracer rounds passing below and behind our aircraft. Fighters broke formation and dove away. No hits sustained by lead element. Other groups in the division report similar results. The fighters aren't breaking off because they're scared of the bombers. They're breaking off because they're missing, and staying in the formation envelope while missing means taking fire from 60-plus defensive gun positions. The risk-reward calculation isn't favorable. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The mission still costs 11 bombers. These are heavy raids, and nothing eliminates losses entirely. But the 379th Bomb Group, which has been losing an average of 4.2 aircraft per mission over Germany, comes back intact. 0 losses. All aircraft return to base. This gets everyone's attention. By February 1944, word spreads through the bomber groups that the climbing maneuver works. More groups adopt the tactic. Loss rates in the 3rd Bomb Division drop from 7.8% to 5.1% per mission. That might not sound dramatic, but it means an additional 15 to 20 aircraft surviving each major raid. That's 150 to 200 lives per mission. German intelligence notices the pattern within 3 weeks. Luftwaffe pilots start reporting that American bombers are executing deliberate climbing maneuvers during attacks. Captured documents translated after the war show German tactical discussions about the problem. One document from Jagdgeschwader 11, dated February 24, 1944. American heavy bombers have begun executing climbing maneuvers during the attack phase. This disrupts standard deflection shooting. Pilots must delay firing until the bomber's climb stabilizes or adjust aim point to compensate for vertical movement. Both options reduce effectiveness. The Luftwaffe's response is methodical. They can't stop the bombers from climbing, but they can adapt their attack profiles. New tactics emerge through March 1944. First, German fighters start attacking from higher altitude. If the bombers are at 25,000 feet and will climb to 26,000 during the attack, position yourself at 28,000 feet and dive through them. The closing speed increases, which makes deflection harder, but it eliminates the vertical angle problem. You're shooting downward at a target below you, even if it's climbing. Second, some units adopt delayed firing. Don't open fire at 800 yards when the bomber starts climbing. Wait until 400 yards when the climb has stabilized. The closer range compensates for any remaining deflection errors. Of course, closing to 400 yards means exposing yourself to more defensive fire, but heavy cannons on the FFU-190 can destroy a B-17 inches 2 seconds at that range if the rounds hit critical areas. Third, and most effectively, German fighters start using pairs for coordinated attacks. One fighter initiates the attack from 1,200 yards out. The bomber reacts by climbing. The second fighter, positioned slightly behind an offset, waits for the climb to develop, then attacks with adjusted deflection. The bomber can only execute one emergency climb per engagement. There isn't time to level out and climb again before the second fighter is firing. American bomber crews find themselves in a tactical arms race. The emergency climb works until it doesn't. Then it gets people killed. Lieutenant Donald Christensen, 303rd Bomb Group, describes a mission to Frankfurt in March 1944. We executed the climb when the first fighter committed. Perfect execution. He missed completely. Then his wingman came in from our 4 o'clock high and tore our number 3 engine apart. We couldn't climb again, we were already slow from the first maneuver. The gunners got him eventually, but we lost the engine and barely made it back. Curtis LeMay reviews these reports and recognizes the pattern. The tactic that worked brilliantly in January is losing effectiveness by March, not because it's fundamentally flawed, but because the enemy adapted. This is how air combat evolution works: action, reaction, counter-reaction. The emergency climb tactic's effectiveness relies on more than just disrupting the fighter's aim. It fundamentally changes the geometry of defensive fire in ways that take months to fully understand. A B-17 inches level flight presents the same defensive fire angles every time a fighter attacks. The gunners know their fields of fire. The top turret gunner covers the upper hemisphere. The ball turret covers below. The waist gunners handle beam attacks. The tail gunner protects the 6 o'clock position. Everyone knows their sector and has practiced tracking targets through those sectors thousands of times. When the bomber climbs, everything changes. The aircraft's nose pitches up 15 to 20 degrees. The tail pitches up correspondingly. This creates new gun angles that the crew hasn't practiced because they never flew training missions at those attitudes. More importantly, it creates blind spots that didn't exist in level flight. The ball turret gunner, positioned on the aircraft's underside, suddenly has his field of view partially blocked by the bomber's own fuselage because of the nose-up attitude. The tail gunner finds his field of fire shifted downward. He's no longer covering the direct 6 o'clock anymore. He's covering the 6 o'clock low position. Luftwaffe pilots figure this out by April 1944. Attack during the climb and certain angles become vulnerable. Specifically, attacks from directly above and behind the 7 o'clock high position become extremely difficult for bombers to defend against during a climb maneuver. The tail gunner can't elevate his guns enough. The top turret gunner can't rotate far enough aft. Major Heinz Baer, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced bomber-destroyers with over 200 kills, describes the tactic in his post-war interrogation. When the American bombers began this climbing maneuver, we initially found it difficult to hit them, but we observed that during the climb, their defensive fire from the rear became less accurate. We adjusted our attack approach to exploit this. Attack from above and behind during their climb phase. Their guns cannot track you effectively in that position. American crews start taking losses again, but the casualties are different. Before the climb tactic, bombers were being hit from all angles. After German pilots adapt, the losses concentrate in specific attack profiles, high stern attacks executed during the climb phase. Bomber crews develop counter-tactics to the counter-tactics. Gunners practice firing at extreme angles during training. Some crews modify their gun mounts to increase elevation range. Others develop communication protocols where the top turret and tail gunner coordinate their fire during climbs, with the top turret gunner covering the stern high position while the tail gunner handles stern level and below. By June 1944, the tactical situation has evolved into something complex. The emergency climb still works better than level flight evasion. Statistics prove it. Groups using the climb doctrine consistently show 2 to 3% lower loss rates compared to groups that don't, but it's no longer the miracle solution it seemed in January. February 20 to 25, 1944. The 8th Air Force launches Operation Argument, targeting German aircraft production facilities. History will call it Big Week. Over 6 days, American bombers fly more than 3,000 sorties against targets in Regensburg, Schweinfurt, Gotha, Leipzig, and other industrial centers. The Luftwaffe commits everything to stopping these raids. German fighters fly over 4,000 sorties in defense. The resulting air battles become the largest sustained aerial combat of the European War. Curtis LeMay's 3rd Bomb Division flies every day of Big Week. The emergency climb tactic is now standard procedure across the division. Every crew has trained on it. Every pilot knows the protocols. The results provide the clearest data yet on the tactic's effectiveness. February 20th, Leipzig, 3rd Division, launches 272 B-17 seconds, loses 19. Groups using aggressive climb doctrine lose 12 aircraft. Groups using standard evasion lose 7 aircraft. But wait, that seems backwards. Then you read the detailed loss reports. The 12 aircraft lost by climbing groups were hit by flak or suffered mechanical failures. Only 3 were destroyed by fighters. The 7 aircraft lost by standard evasion groups, 6 were destroyed by fighters, 1 by flak. February 22nd, Regensburg, 289 B-17 seconds, 16 lost total. The 92nd Bomb Group, which has religiously practiced climb maneuvers, encounters 40-plus German fighters and loses 0 aircraft. The 306th Bomb Group, flying standard defensive tactics, loses 4 out of 21 aircraft dispatched. February 25th, Firth, 337 B-17 seconds, 31 lost. The 3rd Division, now entirely committed to climb doctrine, accounts for 230 aircraft with 11 losses. The 1st Division, still using mixed tactics, flies 107 aircraft and loses 20. These numbers circulate through 8th Air Force headquarters by the first week of March. The conclusion is unavoidable. Whatever the theoretical limitations of the emergency climb tactic, whatever the adaptations German fighters have made, the statistics show consistent improvement in survival rates. General Jimmy Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force, issues a directive on March 12, 944, all bomb groups will implement emergency climb procedures as standard doctrine for fighter evasion. Training protocols from the 3rd Division are distributed to every group. Standardization is mandatory. Some group commanders resist. The 306th Bomb Group's commander argues in a heated meeting at 8th Air Force HQ that his crews prefer aggressive, evasive maneuvering, hard turns, steep dives, anything to throw off the enemy's aim. Doolittle's response is cold. Your group has the 2nd highest loss rate in the division. You will implement the climb doctrine, or you will be relieved of command. The commander implements climb doctrine. Within 3 missions, the 306th's loss rate drops by 40%. Spring 1944. The emergency climb tactic is now universal across 8th Air Force bomber groups. Loss rates have improved measurably. But something else is happening that nobody anticipated. Crew morale is rising. Before climb doctrine, bomber crews felt helpless during fighter attacks. You flew straight and level. You relied entirely on your gunners. If fighters hit you, you either survived or you didn't. There was no agency, no sense of control. Just waiting to see if this would be the mission where your aircraft exploded. The psychological impact was devastating. Bomber crews in late 1943 showed symptoms of what would later be called combat stress disorder at rates approaching 30%. Men would freeze during missions. Some became catatonic. Others made irrational decisions, jumping without parachutes or abandoning damaged aircraft that could have made it home. The climb tactic changes this dynamic fundamentally. For the first time, pilots have an active defensive option. When fighters attack, you don't just sit there. You climb. You do something. It's still terrifying. Fighters are still shooting at you. Aircraft are still going down, but you're not passive anymore. A pilot named Captain Robert Morgan, famous for flying the Memphis Belle through 25 missions, describes the psychological difference in a post-war interview. Before we learned the climb technique, every fighter attack felt like a coin flip. You're alive or you're dead, and you can't do anything about it except pray your gunners are accurate. Once we started climbing into attacks, it felt different. Still dangerous, absolutely. But I was flying my aircraft. I was doing something to protect my crew. That matters more than you'd think. Flight surgeons noticed the difference in March and April, 1944. Combat stress rates dropped to 18%, then to 14%. Crews are sleeping better. The 1,000-yard stare that characterized so many bomber pilots after rough missions becomes less common. Some of this is undoubtedly because actual loss rates are declining. Fewer aircraft going down means less traumatic stress for survivors. But interviews with crews suggest something deeper. Agency matters. Control matters. Even if the control is limited, even if you're still in terrible danger, having something you can do to affect the outcome changes how men process fear. This has unexpected tactical implications. Crews with better morale make better decisions. They communicate more effectively during chaotic engagements. They don't panic when aircraft nearby go down. The emergency climb tactics value extends beyond the immediate physics of fighter deflection. It creates a psychological foundation that improves overall crew performance. Summer 1944. The tactical landscape shifts again. P-51 Mustangs arrive as long-range escorts, capable of accompanying bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe, which previously had free rein to attack bomber formations throughout most of the mission, now faces American fighters that can contest German airspace. This changes everything about bomber defensive tactics. The emergency climb was developed for scenarios where bombers faced sustained fighter attacks without friendly support. Now, attacks are shorter and less coordinated because German fighters have to worry about P-51 seconds bouncing them. Some bomber groups start abandoning climb doctrine, arguing it's no longer necessary. Curtis LeMay, now commanding the entire 3rd Bomb Division, disagrees forcefully. His reasoning appears in a tactical memo dated July 18, 1944. Escort fighters reduce the number and duration of enemy attacks. They do not eliminate enemy attacks entirely, German fighters will continue finding opportunities to engage bombers when escorts are drawn off or engaged elsewhere. The emergency climb remains our most effective defensive maneuver against individual fighter attacks. Groups that abandon this doctrine will experience increased losses. LeMay is correct. Missions in July and August prove it. Escorts make bombing missions far more survivable overall, but losses still occur. The groups maintaining climb discipline lose aircraft at half the rate of groups that abandon it. By September 1944, the tactical evolution reaches its final form. Bomber formations integrate climb doctrine with escort coordination. When fighters attack, bombers climb, and escorts engage. The combination is devastating for the Luftwaffe. German fighters face impossible choices, persist in attacking climbing bombers and get bounced by P-51 seconds, or break off early and fail to damage the bombers. The statistics from the fall of 1944 paint a stark picture of how dramatically the air war over Europe had changed. Mission loss rates for 8th Air Force heavy bomber operations dropped to an astonishingly low 1.2%, a number almost unimaginable just a year prior. To put this in perspective, in late 1943, bomber losses routinely exceeded 7% per mission, and on some particularly dangerous raids into the heart of Germany, losses approached double digits. Entire bomber formations could be devastated in a single sortie. The psychological strain on crews was immense. Airmen flew missions knowing that, statistically, 1 in 10 of their comrades might not return. Every new tactic or piece of equipment was measured not just in terms of efficiency, but in the cold calculus of survival. The improvement in 1944 was not the result of any single factor. It would be simplistic to credit one piece of technology or one tactical doctrine with the shift. Several elements converged to produce the remarkable results. Escort fighters, particularly the long-range P-51 Mustangs, were increasingly able to accompany bomber formations all the way to Berlin and back, driving off or destroying Luftwaffe interceptors before they could inflict significant damage. At the same time, German pilot quality had begun to decline sharply. The attrition of veteran aviators in earlier years, combined with a rushed training program for replacements, meant that many Luftwaffe pilots were young, inexperienced, and inadequately prepared for the rigors of combat against seasoned American crews. Fuel shortages, aircraft maintenance issues, and logistical constraints further limited German air operations. Yet even when these factors are accounted for, post-war analysis by Air Force historians identifies a particularly crucial tactical innovation: the emergency climb doctrine. According to their research, missions flown under this doctrine experienced approximately 40% fewer fighter-inflicted losses than comparable missions conducted prior to its implementation. The doctrine itself, deceptively simple in concept, relied on an understanding of both human perception and mechanical limitations. Heavy bombers, particularly the B-17 Flying Fortress, were inherently vulnerable to faster, more maneuverable enemy aircraft. Conventional wisdom suggested that climbing directly toward approaching fighters was futile. B-17 seconds could never outclimb a Messerschmitt Bf-109 or Focke-Wulf FDU-190. The emergency climb doctrine rejected the idea that passivity was the only defensive option. Instead, it turned the problem on its head. Rather than trying to evade or outrun the enemy, bomber crews would execute a sharp, coordinated climb maneuver at the moment of attack. This forced enemy pilots into a highly constrained firing solution under extreme time pressure, while simultaneously exposing them to the full defensive firepower of the bomber formation. The tactic did not rely on brute strength. It relied on exploiting the inherent limitations of human reaction time, the difficulty of adjusting mechanical gun sights on a rapidly shifting target, and the psychological impact of an unexpected, aggressive defensive move. By April 1945, as the war in Europe entered its final weeks, the context in which this doctrine operated had shifted dramatically. German air opposition had all but vanished. The Luftwaffe, once a formidable and feared force, was reduced to scattered remnants, flying obsolete aircraft with poorly trained pilots. Young men, barely trained and often without the benefit of combat experience, were sent into hopeless missions against increasingly sophisticated Allied defences. The bombers continued to fly, and targets of strategic importance were still engaged, but the Luftwaffe's capacity to inflict serious damage had collapsed. In this environment, the emergency climb maneuver seemed almost redundant, but its legacy was firmly established. The tactic had proven its worth in earlier, far more dangerous phases of the air war, saving countless crews and planes. Major General Curtis LeMay, who by this time had risen to a senior position within the Army Air Forces, authored the final tactical assessment of the emergency climb doctrine for the official history of the 8th Air Force. LeMay's analysis distilled the essence of why the maneuver worked and why its success went beyond mere numbers. The emergency climb maneuver succeeded not because it allowed B-17 seconds to outclimb enemy fighters, he wrote, but because it forced enemy pilots to solve a more complex gunnery problem under conditions of extreme time pressure while exposed to defensive fire. The tactic exploited the limitations of human reaction time and mechanical gunsight technology. It proved that defensive doctrine for heavy bombers need not accept passivity as inevitable. In other words, the maneuver transformed a perceived weakness into a calculated advantage. It was not a question of competing directly with the enemy's physical capabilities, but of manipulating the environment and circumstances of engagement in a way that amplified the bomber's defensive strengths. The broader lesson of the emergency climb doctrine extends far beyond the narrow confines of aerial combat in World War II. Military doctrine, and indeed strategy in general, often begins with assumptions about what is physically or technically possible. Conventional thinking may dictate that certain actions are futile, that some risks are unavoidable, or that certain advantages cannot be countered. In the case of heavy bombers, the conventional assumption was clear. A bomber cannot outclimb a fighter, and therefore it cannot gain an advantage by attempting such a maneuver. Yet the emergency climb doctrine demonstrates that the goal was never to outclimb the fighter. The objective was disruption, the creation of a window of uncertainty, the imposition of an additional cognitive and mechanical burden on the attacker. By forcing the fighter into an awkward, time-critical gunnery solution, the bombers created the conditions for survivability. Physics and human capability set the stage, but creative tactical thinking rewrote the rules of engagement. In retrospect, the emergency climb doctrine can be understood as a microcosm of innovation under pressure. Faced with the possibility of catastrophic loss, American airmen and strategists did not simply accept the limitations imposed by the technology or the environment. They experimented, refined, and codified a maneuver that seemed counterintuitive, yet delivered measurable results. The doctrine illustrates the intersection of technical knowledge, human psychology, and operational pragmatism. It is a reminder that in warfare, as in any complex system, the most effective solutions may arise not from brute force or brute numbers, but from careful observation, rigorous analysis, and the willingness to challenge assumptions. By the end of the European conflict, the emergency climb doctrine had moved from experimental tactic to standard operating procedure, integrated into the training and operational planning of bomber crews across the 8th Air Force. Its influence persisted in the thinking of post-war air strategists, who recognized that defensive doctrines could be proactive, not merely reactive, and that survival often depended on exploiting the enemy's limitations as much as reinforcing one's own strengths. In this sense, the emergency climb maneuver exemplifies a fundamental principle of military science, that innovation often arises at the intersection of necessity, imagination, and rigorous execution. The tactic saved lives, preserved aircraft, and reshaped the way air power was conceptualized in the closing stages of World War II, leaving a lasting legacy that extends well beyond the statistics of a single fall or a single campaign. American bomber crews in 1944 and 1945 survived to complete their tours and go home, not because they had better aircraft. The B-17 was never superior to German fighters in performance. They survived because someone asked a better question. Not, how do we outperform the enemy, but how do we exploit the enemy's tactical limitations? The emergency climb worked because it turned the Luftwaffe's advantages against them. German fighters were faster, more maneuverable, better armed. But those advantages meant nothing if the fighters couldn't hit their target. And hitting a target that suddenly changes altitude by 200 feet in the middle of your attack run is far harder than hitting a target flying straight and level. Final statistics. From January 1944 through April 1945, 8th Air Force, B-17 seconds, flew approximately 291,000 sorties over Europe. Total losses to all causes, 4,750 aircraft. Of those, approximately 2,800 were lost to fighter attacks. Pre-doctrine, fighter attacks accounted for nearly 85% of bomber losses. Post-doctrine, that percentage dropped to 59%, even as the total number of missions increased. The doctrine saved an estimated 1,200 aircraft and 12,000 lives based on pre-doctrine loss rate projections. 12,000 young men who came home because someone figured out that climbing toward an enemy, against all apparent logic, was actually the smartest thing you could do. The sun still rises over the airfields of East Anglia, though today the runways have long since vanished, absorbed back into the rolling patchwork of farmland. The barracks are gone, the control towers have crumbled, and the roar of engines has faded into memory. Yet the lessons of those fields, carved into history by the crews of the B-17 flying fortresses, remain alive in the pages of air combat manuals and the syllabi of fighter tactics courses around the world. Sometimes the answer to a problem that seems insurmountable isn't to push harder, to accelerate firepower or deepen your formations. It is to change the geometry of the fight itself, to look at the problem from a new angle, literally and figuratively, and to turn the supposed limitations of physics into a weapon. The Germans could have prevented it. They had the aircraft, the Messerschmitts and Fokker-Wulfs, the pilots, trained in dogfighting and gunnery, and a well-honed tactical doctrine for intercepting heavy bombers. What they lacked, however, was the ability to overcome the math. The emergency climb maneuver turned physics into a decisive ally. When a bomber forces an enemy fighter to calculate deflection angles in 3 dimensions while closing at nearly 600 miles per hour, while being peppered with defensive fire, while racing against the clock to break off before a collision, even the most skilled pilot falters. Calculating a trajectory at such speed, under such stress, is not simply difficult, it is nearly impossible. And in aerial combat, missing once can be fatal to both pilot and mission. Every miss, every aborted attack, eroded the Luftwaffe's capacity to contest the skies. Air superiority is won incrementally, one frustrated attack run at a time, until the bombers fly unchallenged over the factories, the rail yards, and the oil refineries that sustain a nation's war effort. By the spring of 1945, the 8th Air Force's dominance over the Reich was a mathematical certainty as much as a military one, written in the contrails of fortresses climbing at steep angles, throttles at maximum, wings slicing through 25,000 feet of cold European sky. It was a dominance achieved not because the bombers outflew the fighters, but because they turned the fight into a puzzle too complex for even the best-trained adversaries to solve in time. The B-17 seconds climbed because physics does not care what seems impossible. Physics does not bow to tradition, to conventional wisdom, or to the expectations of human adversaries. It only responds to forces, angles, and vectors, and in the hands of well-trained crews, climbing worked. It worked because the climb bought time, imposed uncertainty, and maximized the effectiveness of defensive fire. It worked because the pilots trusted the principles of motion, inertia, and trajectory more than they feared the guns trained upon them. They climbed, and they survived. They climbed, and their numbers prove it. In the end, it was not luck, nor superior firepower, nor divine intervention that secured the skies. It was understanding the rules of the fight and then bending them to your advantage. That is the enduring lesson written not just in history books, but in the very mathematics of aerial combat. Up next we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.